Hey everyone! What happens to NATO if the US steps back? It's a huge question, and one that's been on a lot of minds lately. For decades, the American military has been the backbone of NATO, but things are changing. Shifting US priorities, especially in the Middle East, are putting new pressure on European allies. So let's dive into what this could mean for the future of European security. Leading up to this week's NATO summit, European leaders have been trying to get a clear answer from Washington. Will the US pull troops and weapons out of Europe or not? For 80 years, the strength of the American military has been the foundation of Europe's defense. The White House's promise to defend all NATO allies on the continent has been the ultimate security guarantee. President Donald Trump, who was set to attend the summit, has put a price on NATO's future. Each ally must spend 5% of their GDP on defense. And yes, this applies to the US too. The main goal of the two-day gathering of NATO's 32 leaders, starting on Tuesday, is to meet this demand. It's about convincing Trump that NATO is trustworthy, avoiding any big conflicts with him, and basically breathing a sigh of relief when he leaves. Despite all this, European leaders are actually more optimistic than they were just 4 months ago. Back then, Trump had a harsh exchange with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and cut off aid to Kiev, which shocked many. Interestingly, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz left a White House meeting earlier this month saying he had absolutely no doubt the US government would stick with the alliance. Plus, most NATO members, thanks to Secretary General Rutte's efforts, have already agreed to the 5% target, though Spain did get a last-minute opt-out. Trump's decision to take military action against Iran, even after campaigning against new overseas interventions, shows that his foreign policy might be more unpredictable than it seemed early in his second term. It also highlights how events elsewhere can really drive White House decisions. But getting Trump, a longtime NATO skeptic, to not repeat his 2018 summit performance, where he threatened to pull the US out, is just a short-term fix. It delays a bigger, longer-term question. Is the US military eventually leaving Europe? And how can Europe fill that gap? Camille Grand, a former NATO Assistant Secretary General, points out what worries me is the debate over the US presence in Europe will take place after the summit, so the Europeans don't know what they're signing up for. She adds that the administration is keeping all its options open. Both Trump and Biden before him have made it clear the US needs to refocus its military efforts on Asia. This means weapons, personnel, and capabilities in Europe might need to be moved. The recent intervention in Iran could add to that pressure. As US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth put it in February, stark strategic realities prevent the United States of America from being primarily focused on the security of Europe. He also said that, for the alliance to last, European allies would need to step into the arena and take ownership of conventional security on the continent. Hegseth has even ordered the Pentagon to create a new national defense strategy due out later this summer, focusing on U.S. homeland defense and deterring China. So far, U.S. officials haven't given their European allies any formal plan or timeline for this shift. Washington needs to produce its own defense strategy first, then review its force posture. Without that roadmap, European leaders know they'll be agreeing to spend more on their own weapons and capabilities, but they have no idea what they'll need first to replace U.S. assets. European capitals are also keenly aware of Trump's influence in other areas. Think about his threat to impose 50% tariffs on EU goods if they don't agree to a trade deal. There's a worry he'll mix these issues together. Many are also still shaken by Vice President J.D. Vance's implied threat at the Munich Security Conference in February. He basically suggested that if European governments didn't embrace more right-wing views, there is nothing America can do for you regarding security. Besides signing off on new spending, NATO leaders will also approve new battle plans and capability commitments. This planning, which started in 2022, assumes a 30% increase in European efforts to defend the continent. But here's the catch. It also assumes the U.S. military presence in Europe will stay the same. As one French military official admits, that's a huge question mark. The official told the FT, the U.S. signed off on the plans, but we simply don't know if they might come back in a few months or a year and say, actually, we're changing the footprint of our forces in Europe, so you guys will have to do more. They added, "This is just unknowable at this point and cannot be planned for." Trump first demanded that all NATO allies increase their defense spending to 5% of GDP soon after his election win, privately threatening that this was the cost of continued U.S. protection. After his inauguration, it became official. He called for an equalization of defense spending, even as his administration promised the U.S. would stand by its mutual defense commitments. With Rutte's help and Trump's approval, NATO leaders will all pledge to hit the 5% spending level by 2035. This will include 3.5% on core defense capabilities and an additional 1.5% on related areas like cybersecurity and infrastructure. Rutte explained last week that these targets describe what capabilities allies need to invest in over the coming years, from our air defense and fighter jets to tanks, drones, logistics, and of course personnel. He emphasized that the 3.5% core defense spending is now deeply embedded in NATO's defense planning. At first glance, Trump's financial demands and call for equalization seem to align with some European leaders like French President Macron, who want the continent's armies to have more strategic autonomy. However, significantly strengthening this so-called European pillar within the alliance is incredibly complex. Why? Because of Europe's massive reliance on the U.S. The U.S. doesn't just support and supply the alliance's armies, it also coordinates and commands them. Carlo Mazzala, a professor of international politics, says there is no European pillar. This is an empty phrase. He explains NATO is an integrated military command structure, like a wheel. The European forces are like the spokes, and the US is the hub which ties them all together and makes sure the wheel can run. Who is going to replace this function? Mazzala adds that without someone to fill the role the U.S. has played for decades, NATO moves from a modern alliance with an integrated military command structure to a kind of classical alliance with a mutual defense commitment. France, with its unique history and military independence, has always had a special relationship with NATO. They built their own nuclear weapons to avoid relying on the U.S. and have kept homegrown defense contractors instead of buying American. Macron's position on defense sovereignty, once seen as provocative by some, is now gaining traction. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its ongoing threat to Eastern NATO members, and Trump's questioning of the transatlantic alliance's importance have all fueled this shift. The European Commission is also pushing for increased defense spending. Kaja Kallas, vice president of the European Commission, warned that Russia is spending more on defense than on its own healthcare, education, and social policy combined. She called the threat to transatlantic unity and security a problem for us all. Unlike some European allies, France doesn't see a possible American troop reduction as an existential problem. They believe the region can reduce its reliance on the U.S. over the next decade. However, the scale of that task is huge. Beyond some British and French capabilities, European militaries rely almost entirely on the U.S. for crucial strategic enablers. This includes intelligence, surveillance, heavy lift aircraft, space assets, and command and control operations. These are all expensive and time-consuming to replace, and officials believe much of this would need to be developed and funded jointly. Camille Grand, the former NATO official, says that making up for a U.S. reduction in troops is sort of manageable, even with a relatively short time frame for European capitals. But she warns, if we start looking at critical enablers, even short of nuclear deterrence, there the demands are much higher and the time frame is at a minimum of a few years, possibly up to a decade. There the absence of an agreed and coordinated plan is much more damaging than for the unilateral withdrawal of a few thousand troops. In other areas where Europe heavily relies on the US, like air and missile defense and long-range strike weapons, many capitals have asked the EU for financial help and help in finding European alternatives. A recent loan facility set up by Brussels can be used for jointly procured weapons. A senior European official involved in transatlantic negotiations says we're not creating an EU army, but it's clear that Brussels and the member states want a stronger European leg inside NATO. They believe the EU will start taking on responsibilities previously handled only by NATO, like interoperability, standards, and joint procurement. In recent months, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius has urged his U.S. counterpart, Hegseth, to provide a roadmap for a U.S. pullback from Europe. This move, aiming to give Berlin and its European allies a clear timeline for what assets they need to prioritize and how fast, has actually annoyed other NATO capitals. They believe pushing the US to clarify its withdrawal plans would only make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. This has led to an inconsistent approach. As one senior European official put it, engage with the Americans like hell to keep them as close as possible, while at the same time preparing as fast as we can for them to walk away. They admit, is that crazy? Yes, but the whole context is insane.
This disagreement highlights the nervousness within NATO about U.S. planning and the fear of what a sudden decision by the Trump administration could mean. Some NATO diplomats privately criticize Pistorius's outreach, saying it risks confusing the message to Washington. But they also admit that the longer the U.S. takes to decide, the more time Europe gains to get political support for increased financing and rearmament. Giuseppe Spadafora, an analyst at the EU Institute for Security Studies, explains European allies in NATO may fear that they could set in motion the very outcome they seek to avoid. The more they plan to replace the U.S. presence, the more excuse they will give U.S. policymakers to leave. He adds, if we start making these changes, the Americans will be more inclined to say their withdrawal plan is even more useful because we Europeans are doing it anyway. A French diplomat summarizes the situation. First, we must do nothing that would encourage the Americans to leave because that's not in our interest. Then, if it becomes inevitable, our main priority is that the Americans are transparent with the other members of the alliance so that the process can be orderly. Pistorius has argued that a roadmap is crucial to avoid a sudden and potentially dangerous U.S. withdrawal. A senior German official references the messy U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, saying, "We all have trauma from Afghanistan." Germany is set to play a huge role in NATO's future no matter what the U.S. decides. Unlike the UK and France, which face financial constraints, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz is attending his first NATO summit with newfound financial flexibility. After relaxing Germany's constitutional debt limit to allow virtually unlimited borrowing for the military, he has fully embraced Rute's proposal. Merz told MPs last month that the federal government will provide all the financial resources that the Bundeswehr, or Germany's armed forces, need to become the strongest conventional army in Europe. Even though Trump told Merz earlier this month that the large U.S. military contingent in Germany would remain, Germany is working on the assumption that those numbers will significantly decrease in the coming years. Of the roughly 90,000 U.S. troops in Europe, about 37,000 are in Germany. A German official notes, "We have to look reality in the face. We shouldn't count on the same U.S. contingent that they have now." Pistorius said earlier this month that Germany's armed forces, currently at 180,000 professional soldiers and already short of their targets, would need to find an additional 50 to 60,000 recruits to meet Berlin's commitments to NATO by the end of the 2030s. While Pistorius is eager to ensure a smooth and synchronized shift of responsibilities from the U.S. to Europe, a German official suggests much will depend on the U.S. The White House will dictate the tempo of this shift, and so will what happens in the world. The official says, pointing to increased Chinese aggression in the Pacific as one factor that could speed things up. NATO officials are certain of one thing. Even in the best-case scenario, where Trump leaves The Hague with 31 new spending commitments and declares the alliance more powerful than ever, its future, and America's role in it, remains uncertain. Gabrielis Landsbergis, the Lithuanian's former foreign minister, sums it up. The transatlantic relationship is fundamentally different, but not everyone takes that for what it is. He notes that many Eastern European countries are less realistic about the change than Western Europe, still hoping for better outcomes rather than preparing for the most likely ones. Mark Rute, facing the tough job of getting Elias to agree to ambitious spending plans while not knowing Washington's exact plans, argues that regardless of Trump's ultimate decision, it's in Europe's best interest to become more self-reliant. He stated, "We don't have to do this because of an audience of one. We have to do this to keep 1 billion people safe." Experts suggest Europe needs to act fast. Carlo Massala, the university professor, says the U.S. is not interested in a roadmap. They want to have a free hand.
He stresses that speed is important now, that Europe gets together, spends on its defense, coordinates its procurement policies, and has a plan for who's going to buy what. He concludes with a striking image. All the Europeans are looking at the US like the rabbit looks at the snake, hoping that the snake won't bite them. What do you think is the most pressing challenge for NATO in the coming years?